Welcome to i-TUTOR Economics NCERT series. Today we are starting chapter 4, Current Challenges Facing the Indian Economy. India, as we all know, it is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But despite this growth, our country faces several major challenges that affect millions of people in their everyday life. Some of the most important issues we will discuss in this chapter are poverty, development of rural India, building infrastructure, human capital investment, that means investment in health and education, then employment generation and also environmental sustainability. Now, why are these challenges so important? Because India is a billion plus population country. Our people, that means our human capital, are our biggest strength. But to truly make them an asset, we must invest in their education, skill, and health. At the same time, we need to create jobs so that every capable person can contribute productively to the nation's growth. Another important issue we will focus on is sustainable development, meaning development that meets the need of the present without harming the ability of future generation to meet their needs. So in this unit, we will be discussing what these challenges mean, how they affect our economy, and what steps the government has taken to solve them. So each section, poverty, development of rural India, building infrastructure, human capital, employment and environment, we will be studied one by one with examples and government initiatives. Now let's look at the introduction part. In the previous chapters, we studied how India's economic policies have evolved over the past 5 years and half decades, and how they have affected various development indicators like growth, employment and income distribution. Now, one of the major aims of independent India has always been to provide minimum basic needs to every citizen and to reduce poverty. The 5-year plans that we discussed earlier were not just about industrial growth or production. They were designed with a special focus on the upliftment of the poorest of the poor. So Antyodaya, it literally means the rise of the last person. The rise of the last person. That means the government aimed to bring even the most disadvantaged people into the mainstream of development and to ensure a minimum standard of living for all. In fact, our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru said, while addressing the Constituent Assembly in 1947, beautifully he expressed this vision. He said, "This achievement, independence, is but a step, an opening of opportunity to the great triumphs and achievements that await us. The ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity." What did he say? And is but a step. Independence is but a step, an opening of opportunity to the great triumphs and achievements that awaits us, the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. So this quote perfectly summarizes the spirit of independent India. Freedom was not just about political independence, but also about economic and social upliftment of every single person. So, as we move forward in this chapter, we will try to understand how far we have come in achieving these goals and what challenges still remain in front of us, especially in tackling poverty and ensuring inclusive development. Now that we have seen what India aimed for after independence, let's look at where we stand today. So, poverty is not a challenge for India alone. It's a challenge for the entire world. But the sad reality is that more than 1/5 of the world's poor live in India itself. More than 1/5 of world's poor live in India alone. That means out of all poor people in the world, a very large share, about 260 million people in India, are still unable to meet even their basic needs like food, clothing, shelter, education and healthcare. Poverty has many faces. It looks different in different places and it changes over time. For some, it might mean not having enough to eat every day. For others, it could mean not being able to send their children to school, not having a safe home, or not getting proper medical treatment when they are sick. So, poverty is not just a number. It's a situation that people desperately want to escape. That's why we say poverty is a call to action, not only for the poor but also for the rich and powerful. It's a call to change the world so that everyone, regardless of where they are born, can have enough food, a safe place to live, access to education and healthcare, protection from violence, and a say in the decision that affects their lives. But before we can fight poverty effectively, we must understand it properly. We need to know what helps reduce poverty, what doesn't work, and how it changes over time. For that, we must define, measure, and study poverty carefully. Since poverty has many dimensions, we can't look at it only from the income point of view. We can't look at it only from the income point of view. We must study it using a variety of indicators like levels of income and consumption, social indicators such as health and education, and even vulnerability indicators like how exposed people are to risk or how much access they have to social and political opportunities. Now, let's discuss a very important question. Who are the poor? If you look around in your own locality, whether in a village or a city, you will notice something very clear. Some families live comfortably, while others struggle just to survive. To understand better, let's think about the story of Anu and Sudha. They are two girls who represent two extremes of society. Anu, she comes from a well-off family, while Sudha, her family struggles to meet even their daily needs. Between these two extremes, there are many people who fall in between, neither very rich nor extremely poor. Now, let's look at some examples of poor and vulnerable groups in urban areas. We see pushcart vendors, street cobblers, flower stringing women, rag pickers, small street vendors, and even beggars. Most of them possess very few assets. They don't have land, property, or savings. They live in kacha houses like huts made of mud walls with roof made of grass, thatch, bamboo, or wood. And some among them don't even have a proper house. They sleep on the streets or under bridges. Now, what about the rural poor? Those who live in the villages? Yes, many of them are landless. Many of them are landless or landless laborers, meaning they don't own any farmland and have to work on others' field for wages. Even those who have some land usually own dry or wasteland, which doesn't produce much. As a result, many of these families can't even afford 2 meals a day. Starvation and hunger are common features in the lives of poorest households. But poverty is not just about food or housing. It's also about lack of opportunities. Most poor people cannot read or write. They lack basic literacy and skills. Because of this, they have very limited chances to earn a decent income. Okay, very limited chance. And even when they get work, it's often unstable. They don't have a regular job or a steady source of income. So when we talk about poverty, we must remember it's not only the absence of money, but also the absence of security, opportunity, and hope. Now let's understand what kind of life the poor actually have or actually live. When we talk about poverty, it's not just about lack of money, it's about a chain of disadvantages. Poor health, lack of education, no proper food, and no safety net. Let's look at some of these conditions more closely. First one is malnutrition. Among the poor, it is alarmingly high. Poor people often can't afford a balanced diet. So they end up weak, sick, and unable to work properly, which again traps them in poverty. This is called vicious cycle of poverty, Now, the second reason is ill health and disability. This also make them even worse. When a person falls ill or become weak, they can't work and earn money. Then they borrow from money lenders at a very high interest rate, which pushes them into a chronic debt. And the third reason is vulnerability. And what's the third reason? Vulnerability means they are always at risk. Poor people often have no bargaining power. They can't demand fair wages or better working conditions. Many are exploited by employers or middlemen. And what's the next thing? Next reason? Yes, lack of basic amenities. Lack of basic amenities. What does that mean? Yes, many poor households don't have electricity. They cook using firewood or cow dung, which is not only smoky but also bad for health. Next, unsafe drinking water. Many of them have to walk long distances to fetch water, and even then it may not be clean. This leads to waterborne diseases. So we already told four things or four conditions: malnutrition, ill health and disability, then vulnerability, lack of basic amenities, unsafe drinking water, and the sixth reason is gender inequality. How? Yes, poor women faces the worst hardship. They get less care during pregnancy. Their children are less likely to survive or be born healthy. They have less say in the family decision and often miss out on education and employment opportunities. So the key takeaway is poverty is not just an economic problem. It's a multi-dimensional issue that affects health, education, dignity and equality. Okay, now that we have seen what poverty looks like, let's see how scholars identify who the poor are. Scholars don't just guess who is poor. They study it based on occupation and ownership of assets. Occupation means what people do for a living. Ownership of asset means what property or things they own. So scholars study it based on occupation and ownership of assets. Let's look at this separately for rural and urban areas. What about rural areas? In villages, most poor belong to this group. Which groups? Yes, landless agricultural laborers, cultivators, tenant cultivators, non-agricultural laborers, then and so on. So these people often depend on the weather and crop success. If they are in a drought or flood, if there is a drought or flood, they lose everything. What about urban poor? Yes, in cities the poor are often the overflow of rural poor. Those who migrate from villages hoping for a better life but end up struggling here too. They usually work as casual laborers, self-employed workers, etc. So in simple words, whether in village or city, the poor are mostly those who work hard every day but still can't earn enough to live a decent life. Poverty, so the key takeaway is poverty can be understood by looking at what people do for a living and what they own, both in rural and urban areas. Poor people work hard but remain trapped in low-paying, insecure jobs. That means in a vicious cycle. Now, let's look about something very important. How do we even know what is poor? How are poor identified? If India wants to remove poverty, we must first identify who the poor are. Because only when we know who needs help, we can design proper schemes and programs for them. But for that, we need a clear scale or measure. Something that tells us, okay, below this line, a person is poor. Above this line, they are not. This is what we called poverty line. This is called poverty line. So, let's look at Dadabhai Naoroji's idea. Let's go back to pre-independent India. Dadabhai Naoroji, one of the greatest early Indian economists, was actually the first to discuss the concept of poverty line. So, how did he calculate it? He did something very interesting. He took the menu for a prisoner. Yes, the amount of food a prisoner was given and used the current prices of those food items to find out the jail cost of living. But then he realized, wait, only adults live in jail, while in society there are also children. So he made an adjustment. He assumed that 1/3 of the population were children. He assumed that 1/3 of the population were children. Half of these children ate very little. Half ate very little, and the other half ate half of the adult diet. Now, when you take the average of all that, you get that the average consumption of the population is about 3/4 of the adult's cost of living. So finally, he decided that the poverty line is equal to 3/4 of the adult child cost of living. That was the first ever method to define poverty line in India. Okay, that was the first method. Now, post-independence, let's look at post-independence efforts. After independence, India continued to refine how we identify poor people. The Planning Commission made several efforts over time. In 1962, a study group was formed to look into poverty measurement. In 1979, a task force on projections of minimum need and effective consumption demand was created. And in 1989, an expert group was set up to make things even more scientific and accurate. Each group tried to make the poverty measurement more realistic by considering things like food, clothing, shelter, health, and education. So the key takeaway is measuring poverty is not just about income. It's about understanding people's real living conditions. And it all started with Dadabhai Naoroji's idea. That means the jail cost of living. So far, we discussed how the government and experts try to define poverty and create a poverty line. Now, let's go a little deeper into how economists and researchers have looked at poverty. So, individual economist efforts. Apart from committees and government groups, many individual economists have also tried to develop their own methods for measuring poverty. They studied how much a person needs to spend on food, then clothing, shelter, and other essentials, and then decided what minimum income level is required for a person to live a decent life. And they divide people using poverty line. For the purpose of understanding poverty, we divide people into two broad categories. What are they? Yes, poor and the non-poor. So we divided them into two categories, poor and the non-poor. And above the poverty line acts the dividing line between them. Now imagine a line. Below the line are the poor and above the line are the non-poor. But remember, this is not a simple black and white division. There are different levels of poverty and richness. Let's see. Among the poor, there are absolutely poor, very poor, and the poor. Among the non-poor, there are middle class, upper middle class, rich, very rich, and absolutely rich. So, think of this as a continuum, a long line starting from the very poor on one end and going up to the absolutely rich on the other. Somewhere in the middle lies the poverty line, separating these two broad groups. Now let's understand how poverty can be categorized based on people's situation. Not everyone who is poor stays poor forever, and not everyone who is rich stays rich forever. So we classify poverty into different types. What are they? Yes, first one is chronic poverty, then churning poverty, then occasional poor, then non-poor. So let's look at this one by one. First one was chronic poor. What for chronic poor? What does it mean? Yes, these are people who are always poor or usually poor. They may sometimes earn a little more, but it doesn't last long. For example, casual workers or landless laborers. What about churning poor? These are people who move in and out of poverty regularly. Some months they earn enough and some months they don't. For example, small farmers or seasonal workers. And third one is occasionally poor. What does that mean? Occasionally poor, or it's also known as transient poor. Okay. So these are people who are rich most of the time but may face a bad phase, maybe due to illness, job loss, or crop failure. For example, a small business person who faces sudden loss. And the fourth one is non-poor. These are people who are never poor and have a stable source of income and a good living condition. So the key takeaway is poverty is not just about how much money a person has. It's also about how stable their income and life are. That's why economists study poverty not as a single line but as a continuum of conditions. Now let's try to understand what exactly this poverty line is and how economists determine it. There are many ways to measure poverty, but one of the most common ways is based on calorie intake and the money needed to buy that food. Calorie intake and the money needed to buy that food. So, calorie-based measurement. In simple words, the idea is that every person needs a minimum amount of calories per day to stay healthy. In rural areas where people generally do more physical work, the requirement was estimated as 2400 calories per person per day. In urban areas where work is relatively less physical, the requirement was estimated at 2100 calories per person per day. Based on the cost of buying food that provides these calories, economists calculated a monetary value. That is, how much money a person must spend in a month to stay above poverty line. In 1999-2000, the poverty line was defined as rupees 328 per person per month for rural areas and rupees 544 per person per month for urban areas. How the government measures it? The government uses something called monthly per capita expenditure or MPCE, which means the average amount of money spent per person per month. MPCE means average amount of money spent per person per month. So as a proxy for income to identify poor household. So in short, they assume that how much a person spends reflects how much they earn. But is this method perfect? Not really. Scholars and economists have raised several criticisms of this method. They say it puts all the poor into one single group without differentiating between the very poor and the moderately poor. Also, it focuses mainly on income or expenditure, but poverty is more than just lack of money. And it also ignores social and basic needs like education, healthcare, safe drinking water, sanitation, access to resources, freedom from discrimination, and so on. So, while this system helps the government identify who is poor in general, it fails to identify who among them needs help the most. A broader view of poverty is, according to many economists, true poverty alleviation is not just about giving money. It's about improving the quality of human life. That means helping the people become healthy and well nourished, educated and skilled, free from social discrimination, able to participate in the life of community and so on. So development should focus on removing the obstacles that stops a person from living a full life like illiteracy, poor health, lack of resources and lack of political freedom. So the key takeaway is poverty is not just about how much money someone earns, it's about what they can be and do in life. Now, even though the government often claims that poverty in India has come down, thanks to things like higher growth rate, increase in agriculture production, employment schemes and economic reforms introduced in the 1990s, many economists are not fully convinced. They raise an important question. Are these claims actually showing the real picture of poverty in India? Economists point out that sometimes the method used to estimate poverty can be misleading. They say that the data collection methods are not always accurate. The items included in the consumption market can vary a lot. The methodology used to draw the poverty line may be manipulated. That is, adjusted in such a way that the final figures make it look like poverty has reduced even when it might not have in reality. So, While official statistics may show that poverty is falling, it might not reflect what people are actually experiencing on the ground. So, what are the alternative methods to measure poverty? Because of these problems, many scholars have tried to develop better and fairer methods to measure poverty. One of the most famous economists in the area is Dr. Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate from India. He developed a special measurement called Sen Index. Sen Index, which doesn't just count how many people are poor, it also looks at how poor they are and how unequal poverty is among them. There are also other tools used internationally, such as Poverty Gap Index and Squared Poverty Gap. Poverty Gap Index means it measures how far below the poverty line the poor actually are. Squared Poverty Gap measures, or it gives more weight to those who are extremely poor so that policymakers can focus more on them. So, in short, measuring poverty is not just about counting numbers, it's about understanding the depth and intensity of poverty. And that's why economists continue to debate which method truly captures the real situation of India's poor. Now, let's talk about how many people in India are actually poor. When we estimate the number of poor people as the proportion of people below the poverty line, it is called head count ratio. This is important because it helps us answer questions like where do the people live in rural or urban areas? Has their number or proportion declined over the years? How is poverty distributed between different states, and so on? The Planning Commission provides official poverty data. This data is estimated on consumption expenditure collected by NSSO. NSSO means National Sample Survey Organization. By looking at the data, we can see trends over time. From 1973 to 1974, more than 320 million people were below the poverty line. During 1999 to 2000, this number had reduced to about 260 million. What does this mean? There has been some reduction in the number of poor people, right? But even today, hundreds of millions of people still live in poverty. Analyzing these numbers helps policymakers focus on regions and groups where poverty is more severe. So in short, the headcount ratio gives us a snapshot of poverty in India, but it doesn't tell us how poor people are or how deep poverty goes. We need other indices like Sen Index or the Poverty Gap Index to understand that. Let's now look at how poverty has changed over time in India, both in terms of proportion and in absolute numbers. In 1973-74, about 55% of India's population lived below the poverty line. In 1999 to 2000, the proportion had fallen to 26%. So, more than half of the population was poor in the early 1970s, but by the turn of the century, roughly 1/4 remained poor. In 1973-74, over 80% of the poor people lived in rural areas. In 1999 to 2000, this declined slightly to 75%, meaning that 3/4 of India's poor still live in villages. So poverty, while still mostly rural, is slowly shifting to urban areas. During the 1990s, the absolute number of rural poor declined, while the number of urban poor increased marginally. The poverty ratio, that means proportion of people below poverty line, declined steadily in both rural and urban areas, but the absolute number of rural poor remained much higher than urban poor until the early 1990s. Now let's look at state-wise poverty indices. Some states contribute disproportionately to India's poor. 5 states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal and Orissa, they account for about 70% of India's poor. In 1973-74, about half of the population in these states lived below the poverty line. By 1999-2000, what happened? Only Bihar and Orissa remained near the level, though their reduction was marginal compared to other states. Now let's look at some success stories. Let's look at Gujarat. They reduced poverty from 48% to 15%. And what about West Bengal? They also reduced poverty from 63% to 27%. So, states like Gujarat and West Bengal made significant progress while Bihar and Orissa lagged behind. So, let's look at what are the points we should remember from this. First point is poverty has declined both in proportion and absolute numbers, but the decline is lower in rural areas. And the second point is poverty is still concentrated in certain large states. And what's the third point? Yes, urbanization is slowly changing the special pattern of poverty. Now that we know how many people are poor and where they live, let's understand why poverty exists or what causes poverty. Poverty is caused by a mix of individual circumstances and broader structural factors. What are the individual level causes? Some personal characteristics can make people poor. What are they? Low levels of education and skills, then infirmity, ill health, sickness, then discrimination. How low levels of education and skills contribute to poverty? Yes, without education or skills, people cannot access better jobs. What about ill health, sickness, etc.? Poor health limits the ability to work. And discrimination, how? Certain groups may face social, gender or caste-based discrimination. So these individual challenges are often linked to social, economic and political inequality, social exclusion, unemployment, indebtedness and unequal distribution of wealth. Now let's look at economy-wide or structural causes. Poverty is also influenced by problems affecting the whole economy. What are they? Low capital formation, lack of infrastructure, lack of demand, pressure of population, lack of social welfare and so on. Now let's look at some historical causes. British rule in India. During the British rule, India experienced deindustrialization. For example, local cotton production collapsed because Lancashire clothes from England replaced Indian made clothes. India shifted back to exporting cotton yarn instead of finished cloth. Over 70% of Indians worked in agriculture. So British policies had a huge impact on rural living standards. High rural taxes enriched merchants and moneylenders, creating land inequality. India exported food grains, which led to famines between 1875 and 1900. About 26 million people died. The British primarily wanted a market for their exports, India to pay off debts to Britain, Indian manpower for the British Imperial Army. So the key points are poverty is caused by both individual factors and structural economic factors. Historical exploitation like under the British created long-term inequalities that contributed to poverty. And to reduce poverty, both personal capabilities like education, skill, health and structural reforms like investment, infrastructure, social welfare, etc. are needed. Now let's continue our discussion on the causes of poverty. Now focusing on rural India and the role of agriculture. The Britishers caused widespread poverty in India. Natural resources were, yes, they plundered our natural resources. Indian industries were forced to produce goods cheaply to Britain. Food grains were exported, causing famine and hunger. Millions of people died due to starvation. In 1857 to 58, what happened? Resentment against high taxes and British control led to Sepoy Revolt or First War of Independence, an uprising against colonial rule. Historical exploitation under British rule left deep inequalities that still affect rural poverty today. Now, agriculture is still the main livelihood of rural Indians. Land is the primary asset. Owning land increases the chance to improve living conditions. Since independence, the government attempted land distribution. Large landowners' holding were reduced and land was given to landless workers. However, success was limited. Many small farmers lacked money, assets, or skills to make the land productive. Holdings were often too small to be viable. And what are the challenges of small farmers? A large section of rural poor are small farmers, right? Land is often less fertile and dependent on rain. Their survival depends on subsistence crops and sometimes on livestock. Then, population growth has reduced and population growth has reduced per capita land availability and it leads to fragmented holdings. Then income from small farmers is insufficient for basic family needs. And another challenge of small farmers are many farmers face high debt, and when crops fail due to drought or natural calamities, some commit suicide due to inability to repay loans. So the key points are historical exploitation and unfair colonial policies left rural India with structural inequalities. And land distribution since independence helped only partially because small holdings are often unproductive. Population pressure, small land holdings, and climate dependence make rural poverty persistent. And the last point is debt and crop failure continue to create extreme vulnerability for small farmers. Now let's look at the social and urban aspect of poverty in India. Poverty is not just about low income. It is also about the lack of access to opportunities, skills and resources, as we have told earlier. Scheduled caste and scheduled tribes face systematic disadvantages. They often cannot access emerging employment opportunities in rural or urban areas. Lack of education and skill prevent them from benefiting from new economic growth. What about urban poor? Many urban poor are migrants from rural areas. Moving in search of jobs and livelihoods. Industrialization has not observed all these people. Most urban poor are unemployed, intermittently employed as casual laborers. Then casual laborers are highly vulnerable. Why? Because there is no job security, no assets, limited skills and scarce opportunities. Now let's look at poverty and employment. Poverty is closely linked to nature of employment. Unemployment or underemployment keeps families poor. Casual and intermittent workforces indebtedness which reinforces poverty. Rising prices of essential goods, especially food grains, intensify hardship for low-income groups. Then unequal distribution of income and assets widens the gap between rich and poor. So the key insights are over time society has divided into two groups. What are they? Those with means of production and good income, and the second group is those with only their labor to sell for survival. And the conclusion is poverty is multidimensional because poverty can be caused due to lack of income, lack of education and skills, lack of access to employment, social inequalities and so on. Addressing poverty in India requires urgent and comprehensive strategies across social and economic and employment sectors. Now let's look at policies and programs towards poverty alleviation. The Indian Constitution emphasizes social justice as a primary objective of development. The 5-year plan repeatedly highlights poverty reduction. First 5-year plan from 1951 to 56. It urged to bring economic and social change under present conditions that comes from the fact of poverty and inequality in income, wealth and opportunity. And the second 5-year plan that from 1956 to 61. The benefits of economic development must acquire more and more to relatively less privileged class of society. So the key point is all policy documents focus on poverty alleviation and the need for targeted strategies. Now let's look at 3 dimensions of poverty reduction. What are those 3 dimensions? First one is growth-oriented approach. Growth-oriented approach based on the expectation that economic growth would trickle down to the poor. Focused mainly during 1950s and early 1960s. And the strategies included are rapid industrial development, agricultural transformation via the Green Revolution. What about the reality? Growth in agriculture and industry was not uniform or sufficient. Population growth kept per capita income low. Gap between rich and poor widened. Then Green Revolution. It increased regional disparities and benefited large farmers more than small farmers. Land distribution was limited due to unwillingness or inability. So the conclusion was the benefit of growth did not trickle down to the poor as expected. So we have discussed the first dimension of poverty reduction, that is growth oriented approach. And what is the second dimension? Yes, the second dimension is targeted poverty alleviation program. What is that? Targeted poverty alleviation program. Policymakers realized that growth alone was inefficient. So their focus shifted to raising incomes and employment for the poor. This could be achieved through creation of incremental assets for the poor or working generation programs, etc. These become the basis for specific poverty alleviation schemes. So the summary is India's strategy evolved from expecting growth to help the poor to direct interventions through targeted programs. The emphasis shifted from trickle-down theory to asset creation and employment generation for the poor. Now let's look at the second approach to poverty alleviation, which focuses on direct intervention through employment and self-employment programs. The approach was initiated in third five-year plan, that is from 1961 to 66, and has been progressively expanded since then. A notable program from 1970s was Food for Work, which provided food in exchange for labor. In the 2000s, what happened? The 10th five-year plan from 2002 to 2007 emphasized expanding self-employment programs and wage employment programs. What are those self-employment programs? Rural Employment Generation Program that created self-employment opportunity in rural areas and small towns. So it was implemented by Khadi and Village Industries Commission, and it provides bank loans to set up small industries. And the second self-employment program was Prime Minister's Rozgar Yojana. It focused on educated unemployed from low-income families in rural and urban areas. It provides financial help to set up enterprises that generate employment. And the third one was Swarna Jayanti Shahari Rozgar Yojana. Its focus was on urban employment generation. It supports both self-employment and wage employment. So earlier, assistance was provided directly to families or individuals. And since 1990s, the approach changed to promoting self-help groups. That is, individuals form a group and save money collectively. They lend among themselves as small loans. Later, bank provides partial financial assistance to these self-help groups. Self-help groups decides who receive loans for self-employment activities. For example, Swarna Jayanti Gram Rozgar Yojana. Why self-help groups? It encourages collective responsibility and mutual support. It also improves financial discipline and decision making among beneficiaries. So the summary is self-employment program help the poor generate income and assets. Wage employment program provides immediate income and support. And self-help groups make the system more participatory and sustainable. Now let's move on to the third approach to poverty alleviation, which focuses on wage employment and provision of basic amenities for the poor. The government run programs to generate wage employment for poor and unskilled people in rural areas are National Food for Work Program, then Sampurna Gramin Rozgar Yojana. In August 2005, Parliament passed a landmark law, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005. And the main features of NREGA are, it provides guaranteed wage employment to every rural households. Guaranteed wage employment to every rural households. Any adult willing to do unskilled manual work is entitled to at least 100 days of work per year. Work is offered at minimum wage rates, then applicable in all areas where the program is implemented. So this act directly addresses unemployment, income insecurity and poverty among rural households. The third approach focuses on improving living standards through social consumption. Living standards through social consumption. India was one of the first countries to adopt this approach through public expenditure on food, education, health, water and sanitation. Its goal was to supplement poor households' consumption, create employment and improve health and education outcomes. The fifth five-year plan emphasized that even with employment opportunities, the poor may not afford essential goods and services. Hence, the government provides these through social consumption and public investment. Major programs under this approach are what are the major programs under this approach? Food and nutrition program, integrated child development scheme and midday meal scheme. Then infrastructure and livelihood programs are also there. What are they? Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Gramodaya Yojana, Valmiki Ambedkar Awas Yojana and so on. So these programs aim to improve food security, health, education, housing and connectivity for the poor, supplementing income and improving quality of life. Therefore, wage employment programs provide direct income support and provision of basic amenities improve nutrition, health, education and living standards. Together, these programs aim to reduce poverty, vulnerability and inequality. Apart from self-employment, wage employment and provision of basic amenities, the government also runs social security programs to help specific vulnerable groups. One key program is the National Social Assistance Program. What are the key features of this National Social Assistance Program? It provides pension to elderly people who do not have anyone to take care of them. Remember that point? It gives pension to elderly people, but the thing is, they should not have anyone to take care of them. Then it offers support to poor widows and destitute women to help them sustain their livelihood. And another feature of NSAP is it aims to provide social protection and financial assistance to those most vulnerable in society. These programs ensure a basic safety net for people who cannot earn enough due to age, widowhood or other circumstances. They complement other poverty alleviation efforts by protecting the weakest section of society. In short, NSAP and similar schemes target elderly, widows and destitute women, providing financial support and social security. They are important part of India's multi-pronged approach to poverty alleviation. Now, let's examine how effective poverty alleviation efforts in India have been and what challenges remain. For the first time since independence, some states have reduced the percentage of absolute poor below the national average. Various approaches, programs and schemes have been implemented over the years. So that was the achievement. And despite these efforts, hunger, malnutrition, illiteracy and lack of basic amenities remains widespread. Policy evolution has been progressive, but there has been no radical transformation in the ownership of asset, process of production, improvement of basic amenities for the needy and so on. Inequitable access to benefits like unequal distribution of land and access has allowed non-poor groups to appropriate benefits meant for the poor. And compared to the magnitude of poverty, the allocation of funds for poverty alleviation program is inadequate. Programs rely heavily on government and bank officials who may be ill-motivated, poorly trained, corruption-prone and susceptible to pressure from local cities. And there is also minimal participation of local level institutions which reduces effectiveness. Then, what are the way forward? Yes, active participation of the poor is crucial. Poverty reduction works best when the poor are socially mobilized, empowered and engaged in the growth process. So, they should be encouraged. So this involvement can create employment opportunities, increase income levels, improve health, skill and literacy. It is also essential to identify poverty-stricken areas and provide infrastructures like schools, roads, power, telecom, IT service, training institutions and so on. So the key takeaway is poverty alleviation is multidimensional and requires not just government schemes but also empowerment, infrastructure development and active involvement of the poor for the lasting impact. So let's look at the conclusion. We have traveled about 6 decades since independence, right? The objectives of all our policies had been stated as promoting rapid and balanced economic development with equality and social justice. Poverty alleviation has always been accepted as one of India's main challenges by the policymakers, regardless of which government was in power. The absolute number of poor in the country has gone down and some states have less proportion of poor than even the national average. Yet, critics point out that even though vast resources have been allocated and spent, we are still far from reaching the goal. So, there is improvement in terms of per capita income and average standard of living. Some progress towards meeting basic needs has been made. But when compared to the progress made by many other countries, our performance has not been impressive. Moreover, the fruits of development have not reached all sections of the population. Some sections of the people, some sectors of the economy, some regions of the country can compete even with the developed countries in terms of social and economic development. Yet there are many others who have not been able to come out of the vicious circle of poverty. So that's all about this chapter. Hope you understand. Thanks for watching. For more related contents, do like, share and subscribe.